Good evening. We're going to go ahead and get started tonight because we only advertised this until 7, and so I want to be respectful of your time, but also make sure that we maximize the amount of time that we have on this important topic tonight. So first off, I want to thank you all for being here. This is a scary time when you obviously look in our community, but you also look around in communities around us and also throughout our country. Our teenagers are experiencing a world different than I think what we experienced when we were growing up. And so the more that we're aware, the better I think we can support our children. And I also think the partnership that we have with this topic is also incredibly important, because I don't think that there's just one group that can use this knowledge to make sure that we're preventing this from happening to any other children or families. And so thank you for your partnership. And what I'd ask is that whatever you learn here tonight, please share it with your social circle. The more people that have this information, the better off our children are. And so please share this with people who you know. Also, we're fortunate that the Cherry Creek Sports Network, our student group, they are live streaming this. So some people may be watching this from their homes or from their cell phones, wherever they might be. But also, it's going to be recorded. And so people who didn't get to see it, you can tell them about it, but you can also refer them to the Cherry Creek Sports Network, the YouTube channel, and they can access the recording that we'll have here tonight. And then also, if any of you need interpreter services, we do have Spanish interpreters here tonight. And so, or if you're by somebody who does, just make sure that you know that in the lobby we do have those services for families who might need them. So tonight, I want to introduce you to my mental health team, and they're going to talk a little bit about the suicide prevention and awareness programming that we do. But primarily tonight, what we're going to focus on is our guest speaker. And so we're fortunate to have Dr. Franzi Hobson here from the University of Colorado, Denver. And she is a wonderful expert, and I think will be a great resource for us. So we're fortunate. So with that, I'd like to bring up our mental health team. We have 3 psychologists at Cherry Creek High School. We also have a social worker who is on our staff. The 3 psychologists are here tonight, and so I'm going to bring them up and let them talk about some of our programming before we transition to our speaker. So first we have Dr. Nancy Patrick. I thought you were waiting for me to introduce you to come up. Dr. Nancy Patrick. We also have Dr. Lisa Geisler, and then also Dr. Andrew Russell. We also have members of our counseling department here, and so I'm bringing up our counseling coordinator, Susan Swisher. And so every one of your children, they do have a counselor. As you're probably aware, they also have a dean, but they also have a school psychologist. And some of your children never have to interact with their psychologist, but on a weekly basis, your child's support team meets to talk about students who they're concerned about. And so that team includes deans, counselors, and the psychologist. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to this group. Thank you again for being here.
So just a word about how we divide things up here. We divide things up alphabetically. I'm Nancy Patrick. I'm kind of the middle of the alphabet. Andrew Russell is the beginning of the alphabet, and Lisa is the end of the alphabet. But you don't necessarily have to worry about that. You can contact any of us, and we'll get you to the right person, or you can contact your counselor. Andy Cullen works primarily with our severe needs autism program and our ILC program in the special ed department. And so her role doesn't apply as much to all of you, most likely.
All right, I'm Susan Swisher, and I am the coordinator of the counseling department. I think this is my 21st year at Creek. They all start to blend together. But we have our counseling team up here. We are also divided alphabetically. We do all grade levels, 9th through 12th. Each of us has a segment of the alphabet for each grade level. So I'm happy to say our counseling staff has been intact without changes for the last 3 years, and hopefully we'll stay that way again next year. So we have a few of our counselors here tonight too, so on the way out you might see some counselors in the lobby.
Part of our team as well includes our 3 nurses. And they may not be sort of first of mind, I think, when you think about this topic, but in terms of some of the suicide risk assessments we conduct, as well as some of the self-injury assessments, nurses are very much involved in that process and continuity of care. So these are a few faces you might recognize as well: Kathleen Klein, Kim Mitchell, and Darcy Michio-Pace, who is right here. She's wonderful. Yay.
I'm doing the next one. Oh, just some numbers, and you're going to hear more national stats later. These are some of our local numbers from this year. We've had about, and actually some of this changed again today. We didn't have a chance to update the slide. 34 of our students hospitalized from the community that we weren't necessarily involved with, except for helping them readmit back to the school. Self-harm evals, we've done about 26, and then our suicide risk assessments, we've done about 224, and we were thinking today, I think that's up by about 40 from last year, but don't quote me on that. We're still taking a look at all that data. And then SRAs that resulted in students actually being taken to the hospital were about 15 this year.
So we've definitely been finding that we spend more time than we used to conducting a lot of these suicide risk assessments. The old adage, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, is very much true for our mental health work as well. So while we do find ourselves spending a lot more time in that tier 2 and tier 3, the universal prevention efforts that we engage in, the supports and services that we provide to all students, are something that we really don't want to neglect. We don't want to go through all of this in depth, but just to highlight a few things. One example up there, the climate and safety wellness survey data comes out every 2 years. This is a district effort, and all schools obtain this data, and it comes from students and also parent populations, and it really helps us to kind of navigate and drive efforts, plan supports that might be needed, because we get a lot of data related to student safety, things like bullying, cyberbullying, mental health needs, and so forth. The Signs of Suicide program is something that all secondary schools in the Cherry Creek School District have, and it's an empirically supported program that helps students to kind of recognize what to do when things come up. And there's nothing magical about it, but it just reinforces this simple acronym of ACT: acknowledge, care, tell. So it helps with reporting practices and also identification of warning signs. And one last piece that Dr. Keogh actually has been quite instrumental this year in implementing is the Sources of Strength program. And this is another empirically supported program that we've been really lucky to have here at our school. And it's kind of a grassroots, student-driven series of campaigns that help us to connect, to build culture, and to build awareness, and also to reduce stigma. So that's been really wonderful. There's a number of other things up there, but we sort of don't want to get too much in depth to that. But we do want to highlight a couple of other tier 2 and tier 3 things that happen here at Creek as well.
Are you clicking to it? Click. Okay, tier 2 and tier 3. These are the things that we do when a universal intervention of some kind and primary care is not really working, and this includes we have some intervention classes. Our counselor in charge of those is here somewhere. I don't know where she went. We do our threat assessments, our suicide risk assessments. We have our problem-solving teams that Ryan alluded to that meet every week to talk about kids that are kind of bubbling up more. We meet with kids when they come back from the hospital to come up with a plan, a safety plan, and what to do when they're not feeling safe here. Partner with All Health, we do, and a bunch of other stuff. And I know you guys are anxious to hear our speakers. So just so you know that we have kind of levels of care that we do here. And this is kind of best practice across the country right now. You'll hear these tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 language, multi-systemic systems of support is another language you'll hear. And that is happening across the country. That's kind of best practice in education right now. But without further ado, and I know her well, but I need my cheat sheet and my glasses. Dr. Franzi Crapo-Hobson is an associate professor and director of clinical training in the school psych program at the University of Colorado, Denver. She's a licensed psychologist and a licensed school psychologist, teaches courses in psychological assessment, crisis interventions, foundations, and she supervises practica and internship students. She's published and presented on a range of topics, including youth suicide, school violence, crisis intervention, and psychological assessment. She's co-chair of the National Association of School Psychologists School Safety and Crisis Response Team, and she recently helped to develop some resources that got put together following the losses that Parkland experienced. And they whipped together some stuff on the fly, just hot off the presses. So without further ado, Dr. Franzi Crepo-Hobson.
Well, while they're getting this, is this working? While they're getting the slides ready, oh, there we go. I just wanted to first thank you all for being here. This is a community problem, and one we need to be talking about and dealing with as a community. Kudos to Cherry Creek Schools for making this an opportunity for you all. It's pretty unusual and very, very much needed. So what I wanted to do tonight was to just share information. Knowledge is power. Having an understanding of what puts kids at risk for suicide, what kinds of precipitating factors or triggers there are, having an understanding of warning signs, what's helpful in terms of prevention and postvention, that kind of knowledge is critical if we're going to prevent further suicide deaths and support kids. So I'm going to share a whole bunch of information related to those issues. There should be some time at the end to ask questions of me as well as the team here at Cherry Creek High School. I have to start with the numbers because they're shocking, and I don't think people realize how big of a public health crisis youth suicide is in this country. This is not a Cherry Creek problem. This is not a Colorado problem. This is a United States of America problem. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for kids in this country between the ages of 10 and 24. In Colorado, by some metrics, it looks like it's the leading cause of death. When you look up there and you see that more kids are dying from suicide than from cancer, heart disease, AIDS, birth defects, and so on and so on and so on combined, kind of slaps you in the face. It's really, really a scary, big problem. I saw an article today, actually, from the Denver Post that was reporting how much youth suicides have increased in Colorado. Between 2015 and 2017, 533 suicide deaths in Colorado were confirmed for youth ages 10 to 24. Between 2003 and 2005, there were only 300, I shouldn't say only, there were 340. So we're seeing this dramatic increase. Deaths by suicide are only the tip of the iceberg. We know that there's a good percentage of kids out there who are thinking about this and struggling with this on a daily basis. The Healthy Kids Survey is conducted every other year. This was the most recent data I could find. You can see that we have almost a third of kids who are feeling very sad and hopeless almost every day for 2 weeks or more in a row during the past 12 months. That's a lot of kids. 17.5% have considered suicide in the last year, and almost 8% report making at least one attempt. I did want to highlight one group that stands out when you look at the Healthy Kids survey, and that's our sexual minority youth. Our gay, lesbian, transsexual, gay, lesbian, and bisexual students have significantly higher rates of these concerns. Higher rates of feeling sad or hopeless, higher rates of suicide ideation, significantly higher rates of attempts. And we also see similar health disparities in our transgendered youth, keeping in mind that this is not because of their gender identity, not because of their sexual orientation, but the ongoing experience of bias, stigma, and discrimination that they experience sometimes on a daily basis. From the onset, I want folks to understand that suicide is a really, really complex phenomenon. And it's something we all struggle with. When we lose a kiddo to suicide, we want to know why. We want to be able to pinpoint something to blame. And unfortunately, it's just not that simple. Numerous factors contribute to suicide. And ultimately, each suicide is caused by a unique, dynamic, and complex interplay of genetic, biological, psychological, and social factors. That said, we do know that there are certain factors that are associated with increased risk. And having an understanding of those factors is highly relevant to prevention. So let's take a look at a few of those. Demographically speaking, males are much more likely, significantly more likely, to die by suicide than females. This is particularly a problem for our native populations. Although males die by suicide more frequently than females, females attempt more frequently. They have about 3 times the rates of non-lethal suicide attempts when compared to males. That may be because of the means that they use. Males tend to use more lethal means. They're also less likely to come to our attention when they're struggling. Breaking down the risk factors for suicide, we can start by looking at cognitive risk factors. So kiddos who are more cognitively inflexible, more rigid in their thinking, those kids who kind of get engaged in that black or white thinking and have difficulty seeing the grays in situations. Kids who struggle with generating solutions, so kids who really grapple with social problem-solving skills, haven't really developed those. Kiddos who tend to fixate on one solution, and as you can imagine, if that solution is suicide, that's going to be a problem. So again, that rigidity comes into play where they kind of glob onto one solution and have difficulty letting go. There's also some of those overgeneralizations and all or nothing thinking. Those kiddos who everybody hates me, everyone's against me, nothing will ever get better, and they get stuck on that and they ruminate, and it's really hard for them to break out of that. Our kiddos who are really perfectionistic and struggle with making mistakes or failure are also at higher risk for suicide. There are also a number of environmental factors for suicide. A lot of these are familial. So if there's family dysfunction, or if parents or other primary caregivers are struggling with their own mental health issues or their own relationship issues, that can be a risk factor. A family history of suicide is a risk factor, as is abuse and domestic violence in families. Obviously, there's mental health risk factors. The vast majority of kids who die by suicide have a diagnosable mental health disorder. Most common are mood disorders such as depression, not surprisingly, but anxiety is also up there. Substance-related disorders, and our disruptive behavior disorders is one we may not think about. So our kids who act out, who have conduct challenges, those kiddos who are always getting office referrals, who really struggle with regulating their own behavior and controlling their anger, are at increased risk for suicide. So these are listed in order in terms of association with suicide. What it boils down to for a lot of these kids is a sense of hopelessness. They just don't see any other way out. They don't see any other way to end the pain. Some other risk factors I already mentioned are sexual minority youth, exposure to suicide. I'm going to come back to this in a little bit and talk about a little bit more about contagion. Biological risk factors, Those are often related to mental disorders such as depression and anxiety. Social isolation, bullying, which is one we hear about frequently in the news, is another risk factor. Access to weapons, particularly firearms, is a huge risk for suicide. And those who don't have access to mental health services. Our kids with disabilities, kids who have been identified with disabilities and receive special education services, tend to have higher rates of suicide. They also tend to have higher rates of mental health challenges such as depression, as well as anxiety. There was a report, it's been a number of years, but 1985 there was a report, one researcher found that about 50% of youth suicide victims had some sort of disability. I haven't seen anything updated on that, but we do know that a disproportionate number of kids in special education, kids with disabilities, are assessed for suicide risk and have higher rates of suicide. When we look at the most powerful risk factors, the presence of at least one mental health disorder is huge. And statistically, somewhere between 17 and 23% of all kids in this country will have a diagnosable mental health disorder or mental illness by the age of 18. So we're looking at about 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 kids in this country have a diagnosable mental illness. And that's our most powerful risk factor. The other sad fact is that less than half of those kids actually get any kind of mental health treatment. When they do get treatment, most of them are getting it at school. So thank goodness we have school-based mental health folks. So mental illness is a very powerful risk factor, and then history of past suicidal behavior, particularly an attempt. So if we have a kid who attempts suicide, he's already at increased risk for attempting again in the future. I'll come back to the importance of communication in that realm in a little bit. So those are the risk factors, and risk factors then increase the likelihood of suicidal behavior. They don't cause it, but they increase the risk that a kid may become suicidal, these things. Then we have our precipitating factors. These are like triggers, or those things that, you know, the straw that breaks the camel's back, so to speak. So this might be something that we identify prior to a suicide attempt or a death by suicide, where, okay, so right before this individual attempted suicide, their girlfriend broke up with them, for example. So interpersonal loss, those kinds of things can trigger suicidal behavior in vulnerable students. So there's lots of kids have these things happen, but not all kids attempt suicide or die by suicide when these things happen. These are issues in our already vulnerable kids, in our kids with the risk factors that I just talked about. Does that make sense? Okay, so these don't cause suicide, but if you've got a kid who's already struggling, particularly with mental health challenges, and then one of these things happens, that just might be the thing that sends them over the edge. So romantic breakups, a death of a loved one, we know that interpersonal losses, the deaths of friends, and peer rejection is included in that, is found in at least a fifth of all suicide deaths. So that's a very, very important trigger to pay attention to. Conflicts with parents, it's estimated that acute conflicts with parent figures precede about 40% of suicides. Getting in trouble, particularly when kids are expelled or suspended from school. Legal trouble, so if they get busted or they have contact with law enforcement. When kids struggle in school academically. Bullying and victimization. So this comes up again, interestingly enough. Bullying is then both a risk factor and it can be a precipitating factor. And then that extreme disappointment or rejection, so kids, for example, who may not get into their first choice of college, that might be a precipitating factor as well. A few other additional triggering conditions to be aware of. Those are exceptionally high demands. That can be at home or at school. And keeping in mind that this is a very relative and subjective thing. It may not appear to any of us that this kid feels like there are just too many demands on him, but for him, subjectively, it feels like too much. I just can't do this. I can't live up. I can't do everything that's expected of me. The other one's medical problem diagnosis, anniversary dates of a painful life event, and this could be like a suicide of a friend, for example, the anniversary of that, or another type of loss. Tough transition times, keep in mind that this can also include those happy, positive types of transitions, even like things like graduating from high school, going off to college. Some kids really struggle with those big transitions in kind of an existential way. They have that angst and anxiety around that. What does that mean for me now? So those are risk factors. Those are some of the triggers. There's also some buffers. There are also a number of protective factors. So if we have kids who are vulnerable, if we have kids who have some of these risk factors, who have some of these challenges, there are things that we can do and put in place and support to increase resilience and decrease the risk of suicide. That one adult, man, that can make a big difference. One adult, can be anybody. Who a kid can go to talk to, who actually shows that they care, can make a big difference. Teaching kids how to cope, how to problem solve. Teaching our kids how to resolve conflicts in nonviolent and adaptive ways. Family is really, really critical. Having outside interests, being involved in extracurriculars is actually a protective factor. Restricting access to lethal means. There are cultural and religious and spiritual beliefs that can be protective. I was raised Catholic, and if I was always told if a Catholic commits suicide, dies by suicide, you go to hell. That was actually spoke pretty loudly to me, and so in that regard might be a protective factor. And then, of course, getting the support, the mental health support and treatment that they need. Okay, I talked about this a little bit, but just to highlight how big of a buffer these are, those trusted adults, we know that decreases the risk of suicide exponentially. School climate is a real important protective factor for our kids who are at risk of suicide. If we have a safe, supportive school climate, kids feel safe and comfortable and connected at school, they're at lower risk for suicide. And there's the piece around extracurricular activities. And I think we need to be thinking about this in terms of ensuring that we provide access. When some of our kids from under-resourced families, for example, may not have access to some of these extracurricular activities that can really make a difference. And be thinking as a community, again, how do we help all kids access these kinds of things, these kinds of activities and options. All right, in terms of prevention, A public health approach is really the best way to go. This way we focus on entire populations. It's much more efficient and effective, rather than looking at individuals. It considers that full range of interventions to address all levels of risk. And the mental health team referenced that very system that is used in Cherry Creek High School. It really is focused on preventing problems rather than reacting to them or treating them. And it focuses very much on building those strengths, emphasizing competencies and protective factors. So this is what it looks like. They talked about that Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 that their team uses here. This is not anything new. Gerald Kaplan was talking about this in the 60s. And what he did was take what we did with public health, where we address medical and disease in the community, and applied it to mental health. And it's incredibly effective. So you start with primary prevention, so you provide supports to all kids. You start with all kids. You start with the general population, and you put in place programs to support all kids, regardless of risk. And then you move up, and you provide more intensive interventions and additional supports based on risk, so that only those at the highest risk are getting the most intensive interventions, which makes sense. You don't want to provide intensive interventions to someone who doesn't need it, for lots of reasons. Nobody can do this alone. I said that from the onset. There's lots and lots of strategies that schools can and are employing, which makes sense. Kids are at school a lot. They spend a lot of time here. They're accessible. But parents and families are also important partners, because kids aren't at school all the time. And sometimes you guys know stuff we don't in the schools, or have access to information about what's going on with the kid that we don't know. The kids are probably, in fact, are just as an important partner. Very often, it's the peers who know that a kiddo is struggling long before anybody else does. Kids will often tell their friends, their classmates, what's going on before they tell an adult. So communication among all these partners is really, really important if we're going to prevent suicide. Okay, I'm not going to spend tons of time on this because we don't have tons of time. And also, I'm preaching to the choir here in Cherry Creek, because they're, from what I've seen, they're doing pretty much all this. But having a policy around assessing and supporting kids who are at risk, making sure that their school staff are aware of risk factors, precipitating factors, and warning signs, encouraging collaboration with the broader community, having suicide prevention curricula, perhaps having a peer assistance program. Again, sometimes kids are just more comfortable going to a buddy. But when those are in place, clearly those peer helpers have to know what to do with that information. We don't want kids to be responsible for other kids to that degree, but to know when to be worried, educate them as well, when to be worried and what to do with that information when they're concerned about a friend. So at that bottom tier, sharing information, that psychoeducation piece is so important. Letting everybody know, how big of a problem is suicide? Who's at risk? What does that look like? When should you be worried? And what do you do? It's helpful to have a screening component. Sometimes logistically, that's kind of a nightmare. It's very difficult to screen all kids in a way that's effective and helpful. But to have at least a screening component for kids who start to bubble up or are on our radar for other types of reasons can be helpful. Did want to highlight the piece about the peer. Did I skip a slide? Oh, I just was like running ahead and not clicking. Sorry, here we go. Did want to highlight the piece about the peer piece, because about 80% of our referrals for kids who are suicidal come from other kids. That's a lot, 80%. That's how we're finding out about kids who are struggling. There's a number of universal level programs that have been found to be very effective. Sources of Strength is one of those. It's a little bit newer and up and coming. Very cool that Cherry Creek High School is using this program. Another one is Signs of Suicide, or SOS. That's another one that's widely used in the schools, particularly in the Denver metro area. Both of these include an education component and kind of a gatekeeper component, as well as means for supporting kids. The really nice part about Sources of Strength is that it also focuses on those protective factors, which can make such a difference. At the secondary level, I believe it was Andrew who was talking about, or somebody was talking about, or Lisa was talking about some of the the Tier 2 level programs. One of these that's really important that schools have really gotten on top of is doing suicide risk assessments. I want you to keep in mind that this data is a little bit dated. I did this study probably 5 years ago, looking at suicide risk assessment practices in the schools, because nobody had done that ever before, and to look at how often is this happening. Is this an effective approach in terms of prevention? For this study of the 3,400 plus suicide risk assessments, none of those kids, to the knowledge of school staff, went on to take their own lives. That has changed. We've seen not only dramatic increases in the number of suicide risk assessments that are being conducted, but unfortunately, some of those kids have, even after being assessed, even after being identified and supported, gone on to take their own lives, sadly. So this is a good first step. We have to have a way to identify kids who are struggling. We have to have a way to identify their level of risk so that we can put interventions in place, but clearly this is not sufficient. So other secondary prevention that has to go hand in hand with suicide risk assessment procedures, ensuring student safety, increasing supervision, doing check-ins and check-outs, restricting access to means, that includes in the school setting, making sure that, for example, kids can't get up on the roof, for example. Supporting students while they're at school, having access to a mental health professional, continued monitoring while at school, doing the school-based counseling, but keeping in mind that the primary purpose of school-based mental health services is to help kids access the curriculum, to help kids access education. And unfortunately, the school-based services aren't enough for all kids who are struggling. So again, that partnership with families and with helping them access outside supports is really, really important. But there are obviously a number of things that schools can do and are doing to support kids who are identified at risk. And then at the very tippy top of that triangle, the tertiary prevention, or Tier 3, this is where these are those kids who are at highest risk and absolutely need to be referred out for treatment. So schools need to have referral procedures in place. They need to be aware of outside resources that are available, so they can help families so they have a place to refer families to. We're really lucky in Colorado to have Second Wind Fund, which is a nonprofit dedicated to youth suicide prevention. Second Wind Fund will pay for up to 12 sessions of counseling by a licensed community provider for kids who have barriers to accessing treatment. So kids who are uninsured or underinsured or have transportation issues or there's some other barrier in place to treatment. Second Wind Fund will pay for those services and get them access pretty quickly. I know I have pretty good insurance, but when I've called to find out about getting a family member in for mental health treatment, I've been told it could be a month, 2 months before they can even get in to be seen. That's not going to work for a suicidal kid. And Second Wind Fund will typically get them in to see somebody within a week. So that's an amazing resource. Another important piece is the reentry procedures that schools need to have if a kid is hospitalized for suicidal thoughts or behavior or after a suicide attempt. They need to have a way to make sure the kid comes back to school and is adequately supported. Again, that often requires really good communication and collaboration with families. When I was a practitioner, I got wind of a couple of kids who had attempted suicide, been hospitalized, and I found out about it from their best friend. Their families didn't tell us. We can't adequately support kids if we don't know what's going on. And then postvention, which I'll talk about. Okay, just a couple of other things for families, parents to keep in mind. Know the warning signs. If your kiddo says something, draws something, writes something, posts something, take it seriously. If they say, I want to die, life's not worth living, I wish the pain would stop, nobody would miss me if I was gone, you need to have a conversation with your kid. Obviously, if you get wind of any plans, if you find any notes, including online postings, if your kiddo has a history of suicidal behavior, if your kid is cutting, if they make final arrangements, start talking about their own funeral, start talking about writing a will, giving away prized possessions, big warning sign. Kids who are preoccupied with death, talk about it, including if they're talking about violence in general. If you see big changes in behavior, big changes in their appearance, big changes in academics, academic performance, big changes in mood, big changes in eating habits, that should be a red flag. Check in. And that may mean asking that question. Are you thinking about suicide? Are you thinking about hurting yourself? Scariest question in the entire world to ask a kid, for any of us. Because what if the answer is yes? Well, if the answer is yes, now we can help them. Now we can get some support. Now we can help them access treatment. Now we can let them know we care. We need to blow up the myth that asking a kid about suicide or talking with a kid about suicide increases the risk for suicide. That is not true. It is actually just the opposite. If we check in, if we ask, we've just taken suicide off the taboo list. We've just said, you can talk to me about the hardest thing in the entire world. You can talk to me about anything, and I really care. So check in with your kids when you're seeing this stuff. If you have concerns, help them access treatment. Let them know you care and then help them access treatment. Keep tabs on them. Restrict access to means. If you own firearms, please keep them locked up and inaccessible to your kids, at least if your kids are at risk. Share information with school. If you know something's going on with your kid, if you have major concerns with your kid, they can't help your kid, they can't support your kid, they can't assess risk if they don't know. So please, please communicate. Think about well-being. This is really about helping your kid not just be safe, but to thrive. Listen, try not to judge, and don't panic. Reassure them that there's help, and then get help and support for yourself. This is a hard, scary thing. Parenting is hard enough, and then you throw this in. So we need to make sure that we are taking care of ourselves as well. Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to sound like I was lecturing, but I'm very passionate about this, and I don't want any more kids to die. Our kids have a role, as I mentioned. They need to know the warning signs. They need to know when to be worried, and they need to take their friends' threats and online postings seriously. And then they need to know what to do about that. They need to go tell a trusted adult, I'm worried about my buddy. This is why. Letting kids know not to be afraid to talk to their friends about these tough subjects. They also need to know they can't make deals, just like we can't. We can't make promises. I'm not going to tell anybody. No. You can't make promises that you're not going to tell. You have to tell. When kids are like, well, I don't want them to be mad at me. I always say, yeah, a mad friend's better than a dead friend. And they typically listen. Making sure they don't wait to tell. Check in with the school. Who's here who we can talk to? Do we have a crisis team? Do we have a mental health team? Who's on that team? And then they can be supported as well, because that's tough as a friend to hear about your buddy who's struggling so much. Okay. There is a rippling effect of suicide. When it happens, it doesn't just affect the inner circle, as you can see. So this ecological model shows how suicide affects not just friends and family members of the person who died, but also the entire community as well as larger society. And this is what creates the risk for contagion, or that domino effect of subsequent suicides. For every suicide victim, there is anywhere between 6 to 28 people directly affected by the death. That's a lot of folks. So, what is contagion? It's defined as the increase in suicidal behavior or suicides following exposure to a suicide or suicidal behavior of others. So if an individual, particularly, and this is especially problematic in kids, this is almost not exclusive to kids, but a bigger problem in our young people. So being exposed to a suicide happens, risk has already gone up. Suicide happens in our community, risk goes up. Even an attempt can increase risk. So administrators need to be on top of it if there appears to be contagion in terms of increasing universal prevention efforts, stepping up those efforts to identify kids who are at risk, particularly those kids who were close to the individual who attempted or died, or kids who think they're close to those kids or identify with those kids, and then collaborating with the larger community in terms of prevention. Here are some risk factors for contagion. Again, if this person is similar to me in terms of age, gender, background, situation, those kinds of things, if there was a strong bond, if that behavior was reinforced or sensationalized, There's some really nice media guidelines out there that from the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention that have been shared with media. We know if it's on TV, if it's online, guess what? Increased risk for contagion. So postvention is how we address it. It really is a form of prevention. It's really intended to reduce the risk of contagion, share information, and support people in the community. School's a great place to do this. Kids are here. We have school personnel who are knowledgeable and have the means to identify kids who are struggling and to share information and support them. Families also have a key role in postvention. So supporting your kids who are struggling after the death of a friend or a peer, referring for mental health, treatment if needed, making sure that you're keeping in mind those factors that increase the risk, about safe messaging and how you're talking about it with them. And again, sharing information with the school personnel and mental health providers if you're worried. Okay, we have a crisis, but together, there's hope. Thank you.
At this time, we are going to open up for questions. We are asking if you could come down to the microphone because we are live streaming and also recording. We want to be able to hear questions and responses. So if you would just come forward to the mic and start here.
Hi, my name is Owen E Berg. I'm here with my son, Finn, and I'm the father of 2 children who were here at Cherry Creek, both of which were hospitalized multiple times, both for suicide attempts and suicidality. One did graduate from Creek. Finn had to leave Creek because of some of the policies and the culture here at Creek. And by the way, thank you. My heart goes out to Lisa Geisler because I credit my children's lives to her and her team. But you know, I'm here tonight actually not so much for a question, but to give some education from our personal perspectives to the administration here at Creek. I know that they mean well and they want to support their kids. I think some of the actions may not have done so, and our personal experiences can give 4 things. You know, I'm not here to publicly shame the administration, but to educate because I think it can save some lives. So I have 4 points. One is to please respect students when they have IEPs. Finn had an IEP. One of his teachers said, well, I don't want to respect that IEP and I want to give him excessive amounts of homework even on nights that he was dealing with stresses and feeling, you know, like he might endanger himself. And we brought it up to the attention of the administration and they said, well, the teacher can do whatever he wants, which by the way is not legal. So something, please, administration, when you have students that need these supports, to please respect those IEPs and do what's right. Second is, and the speaker noted it, solutions to reintegrate. Unfortunately, Finn spent 2 months in a hospital setting where it had a school setting mixed with a hospital setting. He was ready to leave and come home on the last week of April, and we talked to Cherry Creek about how we could reintegrate into the program. My suggestions were, hey, can Finn just take like a unit for each class, for instance, because obviously how else is he gonna just jump in? And Ms. Doherty here and the administration said, no, he has to simply take the finals and his grades will be based on the finals. Well, for a kid who was hospitalized for suicide, right, to spend 2 months in a hospital and then be put under that pressure, I personally as a parent saw that as endangering his life to put him under that level of stress. And the only solution that we came to actually was that he stayed in the hospital an extra week simply because the hospital figured out a way that he could get enough credits to get for the semester. But it's to the point that, and for the other times that kids have spent, Finn has spent little shorter periods of time, my other child had spent shorter periods of time in the hospital, that there was no acceptance of, hey, you don't have the homework assignments due because you've spent 3 or 4 days in a hospital. It was, hey, you have to make up all that work too. So please consider, the kids from mental illness and what stresses that you put them under. Third, and you mentioned this also, is creating a culture that is respectful, a culture that is accepting. Finn is trans male, and one of the reasons why he left Cherry Creek 3 weeks before the end of first semester sophomore year was because the culture, he said, if I don't leave Cherry Creek, I will kill myself. We moved to a private school called Waldorf. If you're looking for Principal Silva, a team to look to as to how to create a culture of acceptance, speak to your colleagues over at Waldorf High School. Night and day experience from what we had. Here we had not only students who would call Finn a freak walking down the hallway, and it, as he said, walking down the hallway, but even the faculty members who would not respect him, a faculty member who physically kicked him out of a boys' bathroom because he said, you don't belong here. Right, it's a culture that needs to change, and I would say if you want to learn how to do it right, look to your colleagues there, because it really was a night and day, and Finn was never hospitalized after he left Creek to go to Waldorf. And finally, focus on what is right for the student, not the liability issues potentially for the school. My other child, who ended up being the runner-up for Poet Laureate for our state, for Junior Poet Laureate, and is now going to graduate school in poetry, at the time was super excited about attending a speech and debate conference in Berkeley. They were denied the ability to go because they were afraid that my child had attempted suicide before. And my child, of course, was put at greater risk because something that they had looked forward to and was so excited to participate in, they were denied, not because that was what was best for the mental health of the person, but rather the school had admitted they were afraid of the liability in case something happened on the trip. That doesn't help the kid. That helps the school, but it doesn't help the kid. So again, I'm not here to shame you, Principal Silva, or your administration, but more hopefully by learning from our experiences and taking into account those 4 suggestions, maybe some other kids' lives will be saved. I am happy to say, as you see, Finn is doing great. He'll be attending college this fall. The other child attending graduate school, so super happy about that. So, thank you.
Hi, my name is Liz Pomfret. I have a daughter here who's a freshman. I appreciate your talk tonight. I appreciate the school putting this on. I'm a physician and deal with a lot of different issues related to people's mental health. And it's not helping me with my freshman daughter and all of what's going on. One of the things that you tend to hear a lot of, and I'm wondering if there's any data to support it, because it certainly seems like it would contribute, is, well, it's all the social media. These kids they're on the phone too much, they have too much social media. And honestly, as a parent, I'm not sure whether I should take the phone away, limit the phone, have the phone be there and learn how to live with it. I'm really at a loss for wondering what should we be doing as parents in terms of the amount of information, the flood of information, and the constant bombardment that the students in this day and age have by having constant access. Actually, probably most of these kids have never lived in a world without an iPhone. And I'm just not sure if there's data to support this, or this is just generalized fear that people like myself have.
It's a great question. And what social media and technology has done is just made our jobs much harder. There is some evidence that, again, if you have a kiddo who's vulnerable, that exposure to some things on social media and cyberbullying and all this kind of stuff can be problematic. At the same time, you're exactly right that this is how our kids relate and communicate to a large degree, and to take it away could be incredibly isolating. But having an understanding that there is stuff out there that kids are exposed to, and as you said, 24/7, that is so scary. There's websites out there, there's streaming video that teaches people how to kill themselves and encourages it, and it's terrifying. And again, if you have a kiddo who's already vulnerable, that can be very problematic. We know that kids who are cyberbullied may be, again, at increased risk for suicide if there are other vulnerabilities as well. And cyberbullying is so much worse than traditional bullying because it never stops and it never goes away. And there's evidence that kids, well, people in general, because it's anonymous, say things that they would never have said to somebody's face. So I think the answer is have a conversation with your kid. Talk to them about what they're seeing, what they're hearing. What is that like for you? How is it to have access to this? You know, I think we all have our own ideas about our kids' privacy and how much we should have access to in terms of what they're doing and what they're seeing. But I think it starts with a conversation, and I think it's totally fine to be upfront around your concerns, your fears, and your confusion, and ask them about it.
I was just going to say, there's actually some really good research. Jean Twenge, she had an article in The Atlantic, I don't know if any of you saw it, about the direct increase in suicidality rates and the release of the iPhone. So the struggle's real, but I don't think we're all still trying to figure out how those relate. And one of the things I know that we see also is kind of an addictive component to their phones. I've had lovely, wonderful parents who we know are wonderful parents be accused of being abusive because they take the phone away when they go to sleep at night. So there's an addictive quality that I think we're all just starting to figure out. And I think, you know, as adults, we have an addiction to it ourselves. I check my screens a little too much and a lot more than I'd like to as well. So I think as a society, this is something we're all still working on and need to figure out, because I do think there's an influence.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Mindy Cohen, and thank you, Principal Silva and the administration for putting this on. And I've been very impressed with how you've dealt with everything for the last year and a half with my child who goes here. I have to admit, it was very scary listening to you as you went down the risk factors, because I felt like I was going check, 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 check. And so one of the things that we're trying to improve in our house is really checking in and talking about it. And you talked about how it's been shown that discussing suicide does not increase the actual attempts. But my child, it does not believe that, and so therefore he doesn't want to talk about it. Do you have any advice of what we could say to him? And then second question, as far as the phone goes, is do you know of any apps that are actually helpful or you might recommend?
Yes, I do, actually.
I'll let you do the app question.
There's a really great one out there right now called What's Up. The background is pink with a black hand on it. It's one of the more useful ones I found. They have some really immediate things, what to do if you're having a panic attack or completely overwhelmed. They have some nice grounding techniques, some breathing techniques, positive affirmations. There's, for when you're more regulated, some coping strategy links to go through and learn some coping strategies. So for some of our kids that are like, I don't want to talk to someone, they barely want to talk to us, let alone a therapist. Those are some of the same things a therapist would say, and it might be a way to get that information in front of some of the students that are more resistant to the help they need. The other thing you said about your teenager wanting to talk about it, another thing we see a lot is they don't want to upset you guys. They're so protective of you. It's really interesting. They don't want to, please don't call home, please don't call home. They're not afraid of getting in trouble. They're not afraid of, you know, they're afraid of disappointing you, worrying you, upsetting you. It's really fascinating that we have to kind of talk them through, you know, this is our job, this is what we signed up for as parents, and your mom is it's going to crush your mother to know you were struggling and suffering, and she didn't know, or your father didn't know. You know, this is a real problem I see with our kids, and I hear parents say, but we're so close, and sometimes that closeness is the reason they don't want to tell you. You know, it's like, we're so happy at home, I don't want them to know how bad it is. So thank you for bringing that up. Thank you. Oh, yeah, yep. Thanks.
But I think that it's never a good idea to force a kid to talk about anything, and not that we can. But I think if you just put it out there and say, I know you don't want to talk about this, but our community's really been struggling, and I want to make sure you're okay. And if you're not, please let me know, or at least let me know that you have somebody you could talk to. And then keeping in mind those protective factors as well, and putting as many and beefing those up, putting as many in place and beefing those up as well. And then just keeping tabs on them.
Good evening. My name's Rick Padilla. My son Jack died by suicide 2 months ago yesterday, so this is very fresh for me. If I get emotional, I'm not going to apologize, but I thank you all for coming here this evening. Ben, I thank you. It takes a lot of courage to stand up, and you have a very supportive father. You're very lucky that way, so thank you. That takes a lot. Principal Silva, you and I have been in communication for the last several months. I applaud you and the administration for taking a step forward and bringing the community together. It's not, you can't solve this alone. We can't solve this alone. I was with your colleagues last Monday, Francis, a week ago Monday, 40 of them clinicians at the Johnson Depression Center. We are putting together, this is my call to action to each and every one of you. You don't want to go down and join the club that we've been in for the last 2 months. It's a horrible place to be. We had every safeguard in place for my son. Working with Lisa Geisler in this school, we tried very hard. But we are now very proactive in wanting to address this as a community-wide issue. We can't wait till the next child dies to say, oh, let's convene again. I would implore each and every one of you to join us in this struggle, in this battle to fight what's going on with teen suicide prevention and bullying. And Principal Silva, you do know I feel very strongly, and Ben, thank you for raising, there is a culture of win at all costs at Creek. And a lot of kids that are vulnerable are sacrificed because of that, and it's not the right thing to do. And I implore you to work with that, your athletic director and some of the teams around that. It's a very serious issue. If you're not, you don't have to win at all costs and sacrifice children. So all of you, we've got a Instagram, Jack Strong, number 17. We walked to 600 families at Arapahoe High School yesterday on teen suicide prevention, Out of the Darkness it was called. I've testified at House Bill 191120, which allows a licensed clinician to talk with a child for 3 times without the child getting permission from their parents. That's critical because when a child is in crisis, that window of crisis is very narrow. That's the time that they could lose their life. They need to talk to a licensed clinician to get them past that. The school has limited resources in addressing these issues. Our legislature needs to begin to look at these issues. They're very, very serious. So I applaud each and every one of you. Please join us in the struggle. It's a big struggle. Thank you.
Ms. Radia, thank you so much for being here. I can't imagine the courage it took to come tonight. I do want to piggyback on what you said, and working with the community mental health people, we're finding that there's just tremendous variation in what happens when we send kids to hospitals and doctors and therapists and counselors. We have some hospitals that will keep a kid for 8 hours and discharge them back, and then we have some that keep them for 2 weeks. And frankly, we don't see a pattern. And my colleagues, please jump in on when someone's going to be kept and when they're not. There's just such wide variation that I have to say, maybe in my retirement, I would love to kind of start working more closely with community mental health around that. I do know Dr. Siegfried recently announced a job position in the district that's looking at increasing and improving our relationship with community mental health partners around that work, which is so needed, and I appreciate that there are other grassroots effects around that. So anything else you guys would add to that?
Can you explain what is it about Colorado? Why is Colorado either the top or within the top 3 states ranked for the highest suicide levels? And how does the country, how does the United States compare to other countries around the world?
Great questions. We don't know. As to the first one, why is Colorado up there? I think we're currently 7th overall for suicide rates in general. We've been in the top 10 forever. The western states, almost all are in the top 10. It's really interesting. There's a number of theories about why that is, and it's probably more than one thing. One issue that comes up relates to the fact that a lot of Colorado is rural, and suicide rates are higher in rural areas, in part because there's fewer resources and people are more isolated. In very dense urban areas, large cities, we tend to see lower suicide rates. People just aren't as isolated, and there tends to be more resources. There's also some question about, is there something around, our Western orientation of independence and pull yourself up by your bootstraps and blah, blah, blah. We really don't know why, and it's probably a combination of many, many factors. But we, in this country, we have this, this stigma attached to mental health, and instead of looking at health holistically and thinking about mind and body together, and the importance of mental health being just as important as physical health, until we get there. I mean, it was only just recently we got parity for mental health coverage by insurance companies. They used to have to pay extra for that. Some insurance companies still aren't even acknowledging that. We don't have the same access to mental health resources that we do in many communities we do for medical or physical health resources. I don't know about how we compare to other countries. That's something I could look up, though. You know that?
I did briefly. We're definitely not the highest. A lot of countries, I think Russia and a number of Eastern European countries have really astronomically high numbers. South Korea and a lot of Eastern European countries, their numbers are substantially higher. Possibly for the same reasons, but it's all kind of hypothetical. Maybe that's why we have individualism. That's kind of a hard thing to say. Sorry, in South Korea, it's because they put way too much pressure on the students to do
And there's a lot of pressure.
We're going to take one last question or comment and then let you guys go for this evening, but we will be around afterwards, so we'll have one more, and then want to thank you all for coming.
Okay. Hi, we have a daughter in Creek and a daughter at West, and I just wanted to add a comment because we've recently been impacted by an attempted suicide of my children's network of friends, and they were the ones to actually identify the risk. And I had to, reach out to the parents and actually counsel them, and I just wanted to express the fact that I didn't know where to send them or what to advise them to do. I had to actually reach out to another friend who had lost her son about 3 years ago to suicide, to know where to go in a crisis and what the options were and how to limit stigma associated with this. So I think it would be helpful to have more immediate resources, and I do think actually it would be helpful to understand why this is happening. I do think it's social media. I think it's really important to understand why. It helps us understand the social media thing and the phones. As a parent, I think this is the biggest thing that we're grappling with, and we don't know how. And we can't take laptops and phones away because their homework is tied to it. So, you know, this is the one area where I would say if we could do more to, you know, guide the parents, it would be helpful. Thank you.
There's, thank you for that. There's a number of resources. I just pulled them up on the screen. In Colorado, we have the Colorado Crisis Centers that's actually funded. That's amazing. You can call them. They're in every community. We have Safe to Tell. There's the Suicide Lifeline. You can call them, and actually that is routed to someone here in Colorado. The national line is, and they can help you if you are concerned about yourself or your kid or a friend. In terms of getting guidance, I wish, and there's some nice print resources. The National Association of School Psychologists has some really, really nice resources for parents. They also have a nice resource for kids, a Tips for Teens resource around suicide. I wish I could tell you why. Unfortunately, there's not a why. It's such a complex interaction of so many things that it's different from kid to kid to kid. That said, we do know what those risk factors, what many of those risk factors are. We do know what protective factors exist, and so we can work on those as well as identifying kids who are struggling and supporting them.
We had some of our sources of strength kids come here tonight, and there are tables out as you exit that have these resources on them in postcard handout forms for you as you go. They're also on the CREEK website.
Thank you all for being here.
Thank you all for coming.